All right, guys. Part three, culture war. I just got through telling you folks, that my belief is that the baby boomer generation is probably the most destructive generation of all time. And part of the reason is because they just don't go away. As I mentioned, generations are outlasting their historical life. There are more generations living at the same time, maybe as many as 6 generations living at the same time. This is just not something that has happened very much. I mean, with significant numbers in history because of the longevity of people. But that doesn't speak for the longevity of the baby boomers as it applies to the culture. Now, if you think about it, historically, as a generation who starts to get older, and they are no longer the energetic, ideological of an age where they are energetic and ideological, and they've made the world what they would. What they will. They've accomplished what they needed to accomplish, and they're ready to pass the torch on to the next generation. They retire. They move on. They allow that they had their time. They did it, spending it the way they did. Maybe they're 50, maybe they're 60, whatever, and it's time to pass the torch to the new generation. The older folks say, well, the world is for the young, and the young are now in charge. And I don't necessarily agree with what they're doing. It's all too loud and too noisy and too this and too that, but it's their culture. They can do with it what they want. We have little or no say in the matter anymore. We're somewhat marginalized, irrelevant on the sidelines. The world's for the young. But they had the idea that they are going to most people, so the next generation took the mantle and they ran with it, and it was their culture. And every culture had the idea that they're going to improve, modernize, whatever, for themselves, for their world, for their family, for their community. They didn't really think globally 100 years ago. They thought smaller. And even like today, the higher up people are thinking in terms of what they want to do and to whom they want to impact, what they want to impact, you get less and less people capable of thinking that way or achieving things at a higher level. Almost everyone can impact a world that they live in their own little world, their little house, their little neighborhood maybe. But you start thinking citywide, you get less people capable of thinking that way or having the knowledge or the education or the impetus to impact one person, a whole city. Even fewer think of it in terms of a county or a region or a province. Even less think nationally. And by the time you get national, you're just at the tip of the spear, the top of the pyramid. Fewer and fewer people are capable of doing that. It was considered arrogant to think that a person should even think outside of the borders of their own country in terms of how they wanted to impact things. People didn't say in turn of the last century, I want to change the world. But guess what? The baby boomers did. The baby boomer generation, unlike any generation in history, because they mixed the energy and ideology of youth with a progressive ideology politically, and they capped that whole thing off, the cherry on top, with a hubris that did not exist with young people before, at that level and that many people thinking the same way. It is a dangerous cocktail that led to what the crap we're doing with for the last 60 years culturally. Now, what do I mean by this hubris? Can you imagine a Victorian era youth, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years of age, saying, I want to change the world? I want to make the whole world better? I mean, look, there's exceptions. There might have been one or two nut jobs. They wrote books, or they did some, they got into science and invented something fun. Okay. They want to help some people. If it turned out that it helped the world, great. But they're not thinking this way necessarily, because it's just not done. People weren't raised to have this kind of arrogance. People weren't raised to think so big because, first of all, you think you might jinx yourself because people were more superstitious, but also because there was no modesty in thinking that big. And modesty is something that baby boomers do not possess at all. So, what happened? Well, first of all, post World War II, as I wrote in my book, most of the parents who lived through the war also lived through a depression. They just wanted quiet lives. The 50s were kind of an idealistic time when they tried to whitewash the reality of the world with Ozzie and Harriet on television. That version of Ozzie and Harriet, not their real lives, which was, of course, nowhere near as clean and perfect as they portrayed on television. That was the whole point. We didn't want to deal with drama. We didn't want to deal with anything loud and noisy and painful and whatever. We were taught a new way of raising our kids, thanks to Dr. Spock, where we stopped hitting our kids. Corporal punishment was a thing of the past, apparently. It was out of popularity. So a whole generation of kids grow up without corporal punishment, without a lot of rules, raised by their mothers because their fathers just do not want to deal with it. That's nothing new, really. And the leniency that is derived from being raised by just your mother, because dad just doesn't want to deal with it because he went through the war and he's tired and he doesn't want the drama. Or a combination of a lot of stuff. I'm not 100% sure, honestly, where all the hubris comes from, but it's there. In the early 1960s, around the year I was born in 1964, there was the beginning of the baby boomers, the oldest baby boomers, I should say, were around 19, 20 years old. They were in college or starting their work careers, and their wanting to change the world started at high levels. The free speech movement in Berkeley, the beatniks who turned into hippies. They were protesting and they were marching, and they were teaching the younger baby boomers, the ones who were born from parents who waited years after the war to have their first child, or the second and third children of post-war parents who were in their junior high school and high school. And they were getting involved in politics and in the world around them. So there we have one of the major differences between the baby boom generation and almost all generations before. Can you even imagine children protesting during the Pullman strike? Or children, girls, walking during the suffragette movement? And having, and that's not to say they weren't there, but they didn't have an impact. What 40-year-old is going to listen to a 17 or 16-year-old child? They're not. These children might have been brought along, but they weren't there to make an impact. They weren't there expectant that anything they had to say, anything they did was going to be listened to. For those who understand that the First Amendment for all Americans, including children, they have the right to talk, speak, protest, do whatever they want. But they don't have a right to be heard. That's where the liberals misunderstand the First Amendment. They think they have a right to be heard, as I mentioned in one of my previous videos about the First Amendment. But there's also a practical thing behind that, and that is, who the hell would listen to them? But the hubris of the baby boom generation had children, young adults, actually believing that not only did they have the right to say, which they did, they had the right to be heard. And that they had to be heard, that they were going to demand, not that they be heard, but what they are saying and wanting and wishing and desiring was implemented by people who had way more experience than them, and by people who had the power to make these changes. Does this sound familiar today? You think this has stopped just in the 1960s? No, this is where this crap started. Sound like something you've been listening in the news today, perhaps, about children talking and expecting adults to follow through and do what they demand? And half the people in the United States are going, why are we listening to these people? They were just eating Tide Pods a week ago, and now all of a sudden we're supposed to be listening to these kids about gun rights, for instance? Well, this crap got started a long time ago, when the hubris of the baby boom generation said, listen to the youth. And so we had college-age kids performing marches, pickets, sit-ins, and expecting their demands to be listened to by the adults. Oh, okay, well, we're old enough to go to war, we're old enough to drink, we're old enough to drive, we're old enough to do this and that. Yeah, and there's a reason that these are set at the ages that they're set. Because there's a belief that you may not have the understand the responsibility, or more importantly, perhaps the consequences of that responsibility until certain ages. So what business, there's a reason that you can't drink until you're 21, for instance. Well, so what business would a 19-year-old have telling somebody about anything? They'll say, well, they're 18, they can go to war. Okay? When you go to war, what happens? This argument drives me crazy. If old enough to go to war should be able to talk about guns. No! It's not the age. It's the experience. If you've gone to war at 18, then you can talk about guns with anybody with any experience and expect people to listen to you. Just being the age of going to war without actually doing it, and you think these snowflakes today talking about, I'm old enough to go to war, so I should be able to talk about the Second Amendment? You think these snowflakes will ever go to a recruitment office and sign up to defend their country? Hell no! Give me a break. It has nothing to do with the age. It has to do with the experience. It has to do with the maturity. It has to do with training. I would take an 18-year-old who went to combat over an 18-year-old picketing in a school every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And I'd give him an ear while ignoring the other. But the hubris, the arrogance, the sophistry of the baby boom generation that thought they should be not only heard, but their demands met. And it didn't end then. As they got older, and they did graduate high school and college, and they did have to go out into the workforce, they realized that their platform might have disappeared. How do we continue this movement that we demand occur and the changes in our culture that we demand happen if we don't have a platform like a college campus, for instance, to perform our silly crap? Well, the answer was we have to move into areas of power and influence, as I've mentioned before. The baby boomers, the liberal baby boomers anyway, became teachers, professors, lawyers, judges, actors, politicians. And they made sure that the three major things in our culture that affect the culture, the law, academia, and Hollywood, were covered by as many of these Looney Tunes as possible. They took over Hollywood, they took over the judicial system, and they took over politics as much as they possibly could. And that is why that culture of the baby boomers has lasted as long as it has, and lasted much longer than it should have. Combined with their hubris that they are right, that everything else is wrong, and nothing that has come before or will come after could possibly be as valuable as the lessons they seem to want to teach everybody, they won't let go. They won't say to the generation X or Y or the millennials or the children of the millennials, the culture is yours. Do with it what you want, like previous generations did. No. They indoctrinated those groups so they would carry on their work after them. And those who could not be indoctrinated were too much of a minority, they hoped, to do anything to stop this agenda and this culture ever moving to the left more and more and more and more. The legacy of the baby boomers, while many of them most of them, I suppose, are still alive, is that they couldn't give up the ghost without making sure that everything they wanted carried on after they left. They couldn't hand the culture over. They had to make sure they indoctrinated enough people that the younger generations would continue in lockstep with their beliefs and the accomplishments that they wanted to continue to accomplish over the last decades and into the future. The hubris that they and they alone held the key to the future of man, and thinking globally for the first time ever, I want to change the world. I'm going to change the world. And then all this globalization stuff, the no borders crap, and this multiculturalist crap, and America is no better than any other place crap, and on and on and on, is indicative and a sign of the same kind of mentality and arrogance that the baby boomers have foisted upon American culture over the last 60 years, 50 plus years. That now we think globally instead of small. We bother with all the little minutiae instead of what's important, and we don't get serious anymore about what's important. In fact, we've done all we can to destroy the family, faith, the way our children are brought up, and brought in all this other superfluous crap about things like worrying about whether little Johnny should be able to use little Sally's bathroom or not. We're not serious. That's why for last 25 years, nothing serious has ever happened. And it's going to continue that way until something happens. And unfortunately, as I said, for a culture to go from liberal to conservative, historically, usually something bad has to happen. God, I hope that's not the case. We almost had it happen with the Great Recession, but even that wasn't powerful enough to stop liberalism in our culture. And as all the indicators go south, and as our country gets and our world gets more and more liberal and more distasteful and more informal and more divisive and all the rest, which I blame liberals because they own this culture, lock, stock, and barrel, right down to the smallest detail. It is theirs, they own it, and they're to blame for it. I hope it doesn't take a natural disaster, a global disaster, a global financial disaster, or some other horrific thing to shake the crap out of people and get them back onto track. But nothing else seems to be doing it. And we're living with this for far too long, unnaturally long. So, here we are. The culture war. Us versus them. We still fight back against the tide. A tide that is evil. It is wrong. It's not an inevitability, but it is powerful. Don't give up the fight, folks. It's worth whatever it costs. See you on the next one.